Okay. Hey everyone, and welcome to the final day of the Nutrient Management webinar series. We've got great participation from everyone viewing the webinar to date, and I'm excited to end the webinar series with two presentations we have today. For anyone new, I'm Matthew Wells with Lethbridge County, and this series is brought to you by the collaborative efforts of Lethbridge County, County of Warner, and County of Newell. A few items before we begin. As always, the webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Nutrient Management website, the Lethbridge County YouTube channel, and the Lethbridge County website once the webinar series has been completed. A link to the recordings will be sent out to all participants in case you'd like to review the sessions or were unable to participate in one or more of the presentations. Any questions that you have can be typed in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen and will be answered once both presentations have been completed. Please feel free to utilize the chat box. Last two webinars, we had everyone type in where they're from. If you wouldn't mind doing that today for the last one, that would be greatly appreciated. We have CEU credits available for each presentation that will be shown at the end of the session today. Both are QR codes, so all you need is the Certified Crop Advisor app to scan to receive credits for today's presentation. Lastly, the webinar is scheduled for 1 hour. However, we can certainly extend it if need be, depending on the amount of questions we get. So let's start the webinar here. So I'd like to introduce our first panelist today, Trevor Wallace, who will discuss regulations of spreading and storing manure. Trevor has been working in the agriculture sector for over 25 years, including extension and research in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and the Maritimes. Currently, he is a provincial nutrient management specialist with Alberta Agriculture, Forestry, and Rural Economic Development based out of Leduc. His roles include an extension research and policy development responsibilities. Trevor works with a variety of stakeholders to develop and implement programs that support a sustainable agriculture sector. Trevor graduated from the University of Saskatchewan with a Bachelor of Science in Biology, a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture, and later completed his Master's of Science in Agriculture, in addition to a certificate in adult education from the University of Alberta. Welcome, Trevor.
Thank you, Matt. I really appreciate that introduction. A lot longer than it probably needed to be. Welcome everybody that's joining us this morning. Getting on slowly. This is I really appreciate you guys taking the time and joining us. I was going to have a relatively quick presentation going through the manure spreading and storage regulations for here in Alberta. Of course, put your questions in the chat. We can always address them, and I appreciate seeing some of my coworkers that work in the same area online with us today. So they'll be here to back me up on questions or hold me to the ones that the answers that I do provide. So in Alberta, we have legislation. It's called the Agriculture Operation Practices Act. It's an old act, but it has several different parts within it. The first one, the newest part that was added, 0.01, is the insurance for farming and ranch workers. Before that, this is the oldest part of the act, part 1, and it's the nuisance protection part of the act that we have for agriculture, and part 2, the livestock and manure management regulations, which were included into AOPA back in 2002. Now, we're going to talk, or I'm going to talk specifically about AOPA, the manure spreading storage requirements, which are found in the standards and min regulation within part 2 here. And so I'll probably just use the term AOPA. When I am from now on, I'm really referring to part 2 and specifically the admin regulation, standards and admin regulation, not referring to the other parts of the legislation. Now, the purpose of AOPA is to ensure the province's livestock industry can grow to meet the opportunities presented by local and world markets in an environmentally sustainable manner. That's really the backdrop to the purpose, to the legislation and why it is what it is and does what it does. Now, just getting into our spreading requirements, groundwater. So who does AOPA apply to? Who do the requirements apply to? They apply to anybody that is handling manure, be it a crop producer, a custom manure applicator, livestock producer, confined feeding operation, anybody handling manure. The requirements for manure spreading apply to all of them. Now, the other thing I wanted to make clear going through this, I'll often use the word manure, but within the legislation, manure, compost, composted materials, organic materials are all considered the same thing. And just for brevity, I'll just try to use the word manure, but the exact same requirements apply to compost as well. So manure incorporation, manure must be incorporated within 48 hours unless it's impracticable to do so, meaning if there's a tractor failure where you have an engine problem, for example, you wouldn't be expected to get it within 48 hours, you know, to replace a tractor in that amount of time after repairs you would. So now there are exceptions, and that's when it's directly injected into the soil. Obviously no requirement for incorporation, or if you apply it to forages or direct seeded crops or onto frozen snow-covered land. Now, frozen snow-covered land is a little bit of a special one in the sense that that's, you know, not favorable, but if it has to be done, there's no incorporation requirements in that case. There are setbacks for the application of manure. Setbacks are from common bodies of water and residences. Now, I did insert the definition of common bodies of water here. Legislation is the bed and shore of water that essentially has more than one landowner or crosses more than one property line. So a dugout completely surrounded by your own property wouldn't be considered a common body of water, but a water body that extends or is shared with a neighbor would be considered a common body of water. Then there's some exclusions to what is and is not included. And the setbacks, I'm going to get into those into a second here in detail. They vary by method of application and production system. Now, incorporation of manure, for incorporated manure, manure that's worked into the ground within that 48-hour period, you have to be 30 meters away from a water well or 30 meters away from a common body of water. If it's injected, again, you still have that 30-meter setback from a water well, but only at 10 meters from a common body of water. The difference here being that this could be on the surface for up to 48 hours before being tilled into the ground. This is directly injected into the soil. Now, for unincorporated manure, this would be the manure applied to forages or to direct seeded crops. There's a 150-meter setback from neighboring residences, and that's from the home, not the property line. 30-meter setback from water wells, and then the setback from common bodies of water increases 30, 60, 90 meters, depending on the slope of the land. And again, the intention here is to reduce risk associated with the movement of nutrients off source. 150 meters from the setback from residence, again, is a nuisance prevention. That's really what our legislation is set up to do, reduce nuisance or reduce conflicts and reduce impacts to surface and groundwater. So these are our setbacks. The little image here, it sort of just tries to illustrate from the edge of the common body of water 30 meters back if the slope of the land is 4% or lower. As the slope increases, the setback increases up to a point where we get to a property that has a slope of 12% or more. There is no manure application on site until you're out of that land that has that extremely steep slope associated with it. This is just up for illustration. Everything I've just said, we do have handouts like this. This was a laminated handout that was very convenient to put into the cab of the tractor or wherever else you want to carry it. But it just sort of illustrates the setbacks associated with manure application with 48-hour incorporation of the 30 meters, injection the 30 meters, application on direct seeded land or forages, 150 meters to the house, common body of water, and the setbacks based on slope of the land. So this was just one of the little tools we created to help illustrate the manure application setbacks and what the requirements are. Now, earlier I mentioned, you saw this one. This is the manure application setback for direct seeded land. Again, that minimum 30 meters on 4% slope or less. And as that slope increases, if the slope's 4 to 6%, we're now 60 meters back from the edge of that common body of water. If the slope was 6 to 12%, we've increased that setback to 90 meters. Again, this is on forages or direct seeded land. And if the slope is greater than 12%, there's no manure application until we're to land that doesn't have that extensive slope associated with it. And this is, again, just some of the images that we've created to try to better illustrate the requirements within the legislation. And so we have several of these tools, and at the end, I have a website that you can go to and review, print off these images or review them in a little bit more detail. So other manure application limits. Another one of the features within our legislation is a limit around soil salinity. And that's in the top 0 to 6 inch depth. Manure cannot be applied to soil if the EC is greater than 4 decisiemens per meter. And it cannot be applied at levels that increase the EC by more than 1 decisiemen per meter. Sorry about that. So these are, again, salinity limits within the soil. We want to maintain the productivity of our land. So the application limits here are to reduce the risk or the chances of reducing the productivity of the soils that we're applying our manure to. Now, we also have nitrate nitrogen limits associated with our legislation, and this is the application limits. Now, I've included a table here, and those application limits for nitrogen are based, well, primarily on soils group, but there's also an overlay of dry land versus irrigated, where irrigated soils have a higher nitrate nitrogen limit than the dry land soils, and that's based on the productivity potential under those, under an irrigated system. So not only soils group and then the production system, it's also based on whether you have a sandy or medium fine textured soils and the depth of the water table. So essentially a little bit of information about every field that you're spreading on to give you an idea of what the limits would be for the amount of nitrate nitrogen that you're allowed to apply up to. Just 1 second, sorry. Sorry about that. So we can see in the brown soil zone where we have 75 pounds to the acre of nitrogen and sandy soils, and on the medium fine textured soils, you'd be up to 125 pounds to the acre, and that'd be the nitrate nitrogen limit associated on the field that you're spraying your manure on. Now, another important feature of our legislation or requirement on our legislation is soil test requirements. Now, soil testing fundamentally is extremely important to operations, and probably doing it more frequently when what our legislation requires would be very important. Now, the soil testing requirement under our legislation, although I would suggest it be done on a more regular basis and by everyone, under the legislation, you only have to have soil test records if you're operating, if the operation is spreading more than 500 metric tons a year of manure. And those soil tests can't be any older than 3 years. You have to have that one-time soil analysis for 0 to 6 and 6 to 12 of soil texture. And every 3 years, that nitrate and nitrogen level for 0 to 60 depth, and a soil salinity test on the 0 to 6 inch depth. Sorry about that. So soil test requirements, again, it's only if you're spreading over 500 metric tons per year. And they can't be any older than 3 years on the fields that you are spreading manure to. But from a beneficial management practice point of view, anywhere that you're using manure or even fertilizer these days, it's better to have the soil test and use it as a planning tool. It can be used for 2 reasons. One of them is a planning tool on what you need to spread. The other reason is using it to check on how that plan went and what you have available for nutrients to decide what you want to spread again in the future. Now, record keeping, again, fundamental for good decision making. The legislation, though, only requires operations managing more than that 500 metric tons per year of manure to maintain records. The records have to be kept for 5 years, and the records are basically on manure production, manure transfer, and manure application. So how much manure is being produced, how is it being produced, how is it being stored, if it's going to another user, or how it's being spread, when it's being spread, rate that's being spread. All that information on the details can be found either on Alberta Agriculture's website or the Natural Resources Conservation Board, and that's what NRCB stands for. NRCB is the regulatory body that's delivering on AOPA. The legislation itself belongs to Alberta Agriculture, but the delivery arm is the Natural Resources Conservation Board, and they've got offices across the province within Morinville, Red Deer, Lethbridge, staff in Calgary and Edmonton. And they're also a great go-to with questions on the legislation and how it's being delivered. Now, we do also have other tools besides the online calculators or online worksheets or record-keeping sheets. We do have an app that we worked on with several of the commodity groups called the Manure Tracker that is there to help with the record-keeping portion of AOPA, but it also provides opportunities to keep records on more information than required under AOPA to help with decision making. So I did want to take a minute and blatantly mention the Manure Tracker. Manuretracker.ca, I believe, is the website. But if that doesn't work, send me a note and I'll find it to you. We've done it with Alberta milk, beef producers, and hog producers, and it's only been out for a couple of years, and we're still improving it. So anybody using it, we really do appreciate feedback on it. So storage requirements, I did want to separate them out. Everything I've talked about so far has just been on the application requirements. So a little bit on the storage requirements, and I'm going to start off with short-term manure storage. So these are the temporary manure storages that we have in the field. Short-term manure storages could also be sites around the yard. It doesn't necessarily have to be the field. They do not require a permit. I did want to make that point. Temporary manure storages don't require a permit, but they do have several requirements associated with them. First one being you can't 7 months in one location within a 3-year time period. And so that might be 7 consecutive months in one location, and then you cannot use that same location for 3 years. Or it could be a couple of months this year, a couple of months next year, and a couple of months the year after. But this is this was a requirement to reduce nuisance effects, but it also around surface and groundwater impacts to reduce the accumulation of nutrients under and directly around the pile of stored manure. Other features or requirements associated with temporary manure storages, they must be the site, the location of the temporary manure storage must be 1 meter above the water table, 1 meter above that 1 and 25-year maximum flood level, or the maximum flood level that you're aware of. 150 meters from a residence or other occupied structure, and 100 meters away from a spring or well. So somewhat similar to some of the requirements for application. Again, these are around nuisance and surface and water quality protection setbacks. And again, just like the manure application setbacks, temporary manure storages, although this is a picture of a spreader, manure piles must be at least 30 meters from a common body of water, depending on the slope of the land. And if it's 4% or less, it's 30 meters. If it's 4 to 6% slope, it's 60 meters. 6 to 12% slope, 90 meters. And if the slope of the land is greater than 12%, can't be storing manure there. It must be farther back. Now, again, this is temporary manure storage piles, which most people think of as ones that are in the field. So the setback depends on their location to the common body of water and the slope of the land. The one thing I did want to mention is permanent long-term manure storages. Now, traditionally, permanent manure storages are a feature in our right beside the livestock facilities. Either the facilities themselves, like feedlot pens, or a liquid manure or solid manure storage outside of dairy barns or hog barns. I wanted to bring them up here because they may have a role, or they can have a role in the management of field application. Now, there's a permitting process around permanent long-term manure storages, and it does include neighbor notifications. There are construction standards associated with permanent storages, liner requirements, surface water controls, groundwater protection, which is the liner requirements. And there are siting requirements, just like with temporary manure storage, but this is all going to be through a permitting process. Now, with intentionality, I actually put this picture up here, setbacks from wells, common bodies. These are all requirements of a permanent storage, but there's nothing that says the permanent storage has to be in a yard. Permanent storages could be built on anywhere. Now, I intentionally put this picture in. This is 4 irrigation pivots in southern Alberta. Happens to be a feedlot over here in the reality, and the feedlot down south of this picture. Generally speaking, our temporary manure storages, people have often used the pivot corners to temporarily strew our manure in when they can get on early in the season before the road bands come off, haul with end dump triaxle trailers, make a large pile here, and then come later on when they can get on the fields, spread manure across the field from this location. There may be an opportunity for permanent long-term manure storages because, like I said, those temporary storages are 7 months in one location with 3 years, which you can rotate between pivot corners and not have a problem. You could also go through the process to put a permanent storage, and I'm just using this as an example, in the middle of these 4 pivots with access to them so that you can access them early in the season when the road bands are still on before those so you can get on there with weight. You have a permitted storage there. You don't have to rotate it. It doesn't have that 7-month requirement. There would be a permitted facility here, and you could always use it from that location once it's moved out of the corrals and pans here and spread it on the 4 fields as you rotate along through your manure application process. Excuse me, sorry about that. So I did want to bring them up real briefly. There's a few instances where people have used a permanent storage in this fashion, just as another way to give them flexibility that they wouldn't otherwise have with a temporary storage or with the infield or just in yard storage, because they still have to get out of the yards into the fields, and if they have to go early in the season, the road bans can affect that. So one other feature I wanted to bring up, and I know we were talking, or I was instructed to talk mostly about manure application spreading. I thought I'd also just mention our seasonal feeding and bedding sites really quickly. And again, legislation is around protecting air quality, minimizing odor and nuisance. But for those guys that are, winter feeding their animals through the winter in the field, and these regulations require for corral as well. Seasonal feeding bedding sites do not have to be associated with a seasonal feeding bedding site. Generally, they're a cow-calf operation, part of the business. But seasonal feeding bedding sites, they need to be 30 meters away from a common body of water as well. And we have a couple of graphics to help illustrate that. So basically, from a common body of water, that's again that water body that has multiple neighbors or landowners that it's crossed. 30 meters back. If you can't be 30 meters back, the legislation does give a couple of options, one of them being build a berm or interceptor between the seasonal feeding bedding site and the common body of water, or removing the manure embedding before runoff occurs, are the two of the options underneath AOPA to deal with seasonal feeding bedding sites. But I just wanted to bring those up really quickly and mention them. We've got a number of fact sheets, either on Alberta Agriculture's website, which is at the bottom of the slide, or NRCB's website, that detail all the requirements related to spreading and management of manure. And you can go there and have a look at them there. If you don't, you can always contact Matthew. I'm positive he'd be more than happy to help out, providing with you or myself to get in its information, a little bit more detail on the requirements under AOPA. So just in quick summary, the regulation on manure application and spreading apply to anyone that handles manure, that be crop producers, custom applicators, livestock operations. There's a series of requirements for spreading manure that include incorporation within the 48 hours, application setbacks, common body of water, residents or wells, field application limits for nitrate, nitrogen, and soil EC, and finally record keeping requirements if you're managing more than 500 metric tons of manure a year, and soil testing requirements if you're managing over 500 metric tons per year. Temporary storage, great options for getting manure to the field and have it temporarily stored there till the conditions are right for spreading, and those conditions might be obviously when the crop is off, or when the field is dried up enough that we're not causing compaction issues. But there are setbacks and site use limitations, 7 months within a 3-year period. And finally, permanent manure storage is a great option to help manage manure application. It might be something looking into where you can annually use a site to move manure to a location that you can spread to multiple fields from, taking advantage both of avoiding road restrictions and reducing the risk around compaction. Again, I put our website there that has most of our guidelines, all of our guidelines and legislation related information if you're looking for anything else, and be more than happy to answer any questions. Matt, that's it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Trevor. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to present to us. It doesn't sound like you're not doing too well. So if anyone has any questions for Trevor, just put them in the Q&A, and Trevor will to help Trevor out a little bit. He can answer them on the Q&A, and then I'll just read them out to the public. So our next panelist is Rob Lavoie, who will present use of biochar on feedlots. Rob Lavoie, after 30 years of working in the oil and gas industry on projects that sequestered CO2 geologically, holy man, Rob founded AirTerra Inc. In 2009 to promote awareness about biochar, an organic soil amendment made from waste wood and other biomass that simultaneously prevents carbon from re-entering the atmosphere while greatly benefiting soil, plant, and animal health. So welcome, Rob.
Hi, Matthew. Thanks for this opportunity to share a little bit of information about the biochar proposition.
Yeah.
Especially as it relates to agriculture. Now, I believe you can see the screen there. Oh, not yet. Just one minute. There you have it.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. It's all good.
Yeah, so this is specifically about biochar for animal bedding as an animal bedding ingredient. So it would be somewhat upstream of, I guess, storing manure and that sort of thing, or it could be actually just simply adding biochar to a compost stored facility, so a windrow where it could be blended into a windrow. So those are the two ideas that we're going to be talking about. AirTerra was incorporated in 2009. We didn't have a CFIA registered product until 2015, so we've been selling biochar that we source from existing biochar producers in Western Canada. There's one in Edmonton, a company called URSI, Innovative Reduction Strategies, Inc., and one in northeastern British Columbia near McBride, BC Biocarbon. And we also have another company that we have an agreement to sell for near Merritt, Emergent Waste Solutions. So these are different Biochar producers that produce biochar that has necessary requirements and for regulatory use in soils in Canada. And but they're still small scale. Biochar is a very nascent industry. So we're gonna talk about what might we do to increase its use. So we'll talk about what is biochar, how biochar is made, how it benefits soils and plants, how to best benefit from its properties, and then really get into the use in animal bedding and or a co-composting ingredient. We'll also talk about the use of biochar in green manure composting rather than animal manure, and the future of biochar in agriculture, and some, I call it circular economy considerations, because it will require very good integration with the existing agricultural practices. So, and then we'll just end with some conclusions. So what is biochar? Well, I kind of cringe to call it charcoal because that will get people running out to their hardware stores and buying up all of the barbecue briquettes. That's really not what we mean here. Biochar is intentionally made. It is a charcoal-like material, but it's intentionally made to benefit soils and plants. So the whole difference between biochar and charcoal that you'd find in a hardware store is that it's produced at a temperature that's high enough to remove all of the volatile components from the wood, and it's usually the best feedstocks for an agricultural biochar is a woody feedstock, because you get the casting of the original cellular structure of the wood remaining as a very high carbon content charcoal, biochar. So you have these pores and all of the surface areas of the walls of those castings that provide the properties that make biochar what it is. So here's the process. It's just simply CO2 coming from the atmosphere, being photosynthesized by plant leaves and plants. Plants convert CO2 and water into a sugar that's the building blocks that make up the body of the plant. In this case, wood fiber is what we're using as a feedstock. When you take wood fiber and heat it up to 450 to 650 degrees C, in the absence or very low controlled amounts of oxygen, that drives off hydrogen molecules, oxygen, nitrogen, all of those lighter components, and leaves behind a very high concentration of high carbon content material, and that's very charcoal-like. So what you're seeing here is the cooled biochar coming out of a kiln in order to prevent it from any combustion once it hits the atmosphere. The important thing here is that there's also these synthetic gases coming off the process. That synthetic gas consists of about 50% of the carbon from the original wood feedstock, and a full 70% of the energy value of that feedstock comes off in the form of a synthetic gas. So we really don't advocate making biochar in kilns that lose the value of that energy value. The processes that AirTerra is advocating and that we're planning to build near Calgary will conserve this synthetic gas, the energy value of the synthetic gas, and the plan is to be even converting that into a renewable natural gas that can be used in pipelines in Alberta. So the other 50% of the carbon comes out in this solid format, and it is then blended into organics, into compost or manure, and then amended into soils and becomes soil organic carbon. So yeah, that's kind of the process of making it, and these are the properties that make biochar beneficial for plants and soil. So this is a magnified piece of biochar, and so you can see the porosity and the cellular structure of that piece of biochar. So obviously it has a high porosity and also has a very high surface area. sort of like the area of a basketball court per gram of material. It's also has a very high carbon content, which is important for the value that it has in the soil as a soil organic carbon material. So as such, it retains nutrients on the surfaces. It adsorbs. The surfaces just simply get coated with nutrients. And then the pores absorb moisture, just like a sponge would absorb moisture. And it's because it's such a high carbon content and carbon bonds are very strong, it's resilient to decomposition. The bugs and the microbiology, the bacteria and the fungi don't eat the biochar. They leave it alone, but they like to have its availability, and we'll talk about that. It also aerates and loosens and helps soils to be more pliable as well, and those little pieces of char in the soil once it gets there. The chemical aspects are related to the high surface area. Those surfaces are actually charged. They have positive and negative charges, which is what actually adsorbs and attracts nutrients to be adhered to the surfaces. And those nutrients that adsorb and can attach to the surfaces of the biochar are very highly plant available as well. So biochar increases the cationic and anionic exchange capacity, the CEC they call it, for the nutrients in the soil to be available for plants. The biological features of biochar are also important. Because of these holes, the pores, and the nutrients and the moisture, it creates a kind of a party for the microbiology in the soil as well. It's a kind of a great hangout and a place to be actually protected. So bacteria will live inside these pores. Some of those pores are so small that the protozoa, the nematodes can't get to them, so they're protected in there. The fungi like to grow their mycelium and the hyphae into these pores to go and reach for nutrients that they can then transport to plants. Let me just move on. The best way to use biochar is to have a nutrient charged product and a microbially inoculated product. So biochar coming out of a kiln is completely pristine, has no nutrients, well, has very low nutrients other than what might have been remaining from the wood. And of course doesn't have any microbiology. So, but these are two properties that biochar has that is very valuable. The best way to nutrient charge and microbially inoculate is to blend biochar into compost. But that's actually the second best. This is what you would do at a minimum. The very best thing you can do, what we're recommending, especially for this webinar, is to use biochar as an ingredient before the composting process. So as a co-composting ingredient. And one way to do that even better is to use the biochar in animal bedding while the animals are still living on that bedding. And I'll explain why that's the case. Because there's multiple co-benefits to having a biochar in animal bedding prior to the co-composting process. And another possibility is to use biochar in green manure. Green manure is sort of cover crops that you would harvest and place in a pile so that it can be composted before it's amended into the soil. And then this would be for municipal situations. Biochar can be used in municipal organics as well for composting. This paper recently published, it's a September 2021 paper, is the Mecca paper of biochar papers in recent days. It is actually a meta-study of meta-studies. So it's reviewed 26 global meta-studies of papers that have been written over the past 15 years on biochar. So you can see over on the left, on the right-hand column here, the numbers of papers that are represented by each one of these claims. So these are the papers that substantiate the claims that are being made for biochar. And so the sections of the paper I've written, I've just cut and pasted the titles of the various sections of this paper. So for example, plant productivity, mean yield increase of 16%. So that's the average plant productivity increase when biochar is used for crop as a crop nutrient and soil amendment in 1,254 papers. And so all of these attributes are backed up by the numbers of papers that are written on the right-hand column. And you can see that there are many positive features, root growth, tree cultures, increasing growth of trees, carbon increase in the soil, nitrogen increase, soil moisture, available water increase, the stability of the soil aggregates, carbon priming. That means how quickly the carbon is actually declining. So negative priming is carbon is actually increasing in the soil over time. Plant available phosphorus and phosphate, plant available nitrate or nitrogen increase in the soil. So all of these bars that are leaning towards the right are indicating that this is getting better. These are bars leading to the left, to the below the zero line. That means these are things that are actually adverse, but they're reduced. So this would be nitrate. Leaching is reduced. Nitrous oxide emissions, so greenhouse gas emissions from soil, are reduced with biochar amended into it. And then biochar has an affinity for heavy metals, and these negative bars are showing how plants grown in soils that have biochar amendment are shown to be lower in content of these heavy metals. So it's a paper, you can actually easily Google that paper over the internet and find that substantiation for these claims. So the use of biochar as an animal bedding controls ammonia emissions. And this is an example of a farmer near New Sarepta, Ron Steinke in Alberta here, who's using our product as a amendment into the bedding of a cattle shed in the spring. Before cleaning it out, he's put the biochar on top of the cattle bedding and then loaded it into a manure spreader here and generated this windrow to blend it all together and allow it to be co-composted. We're now locating at and collaborating with a farm called Migo Ranch near Crossfield, Alberta, and they're using biochar as a bedding for poultry. This is a small poultry coop that we started out with, but this shed behind here that you can see in the photo is now going to be full of poultry as well, and I think they've actually built out this structure so that they can have a larger poultry area. So for cattle and poultry, definitely biochar can provide these benefits in the animal bedding. So reduce anaerobic conditions of the bedding, prevent nutrient losses via volatilization from day one. So that means when the biochar is in the bedding, right from the start of animals defecating and urinating, the nutrients will be retained rather than volatilize, and we'll talk about that. It reduces indoor ammonium concentrations, and animal health in barns are improved for respiratory conditions, reduces foot hoof diseases. There's a bit of a cautionary note here. Biochar has a high pH value, and by reducing the pH of the biochar using sort of acidic amendments as well to condition the biochar, you can actually increase the ammonium absorption. You have high plant available nutrients coating each of the biochar particles once it's been composted. And that use in bedding also gives you this best condition where biochars are fully inoculated and nutrient charged before they go out into the soil. I'm having that same problem that Trevor had here. I'm just gonna have to take some water. Okay, so here are some papers that have shown that a 9% volume ratio of bamboo biochar in an animal bedding has reduced nitrogen losses by 64%. 20% has done something similar. 5 to 10% weight percent biochar in a particular study, and I've just listed those study names down, the authors of these studies below. By 30 to 40%. Use of sulfuric acid was what a couple authors here, Days and Ritz, used in order to increase the ammonium absorption capacity of the biochar. So, this is just a cautionary note that losses of nitrogen, actually, if you wait, this is the point of this section, is that if you wait to add the biochar into the bedding after or at the point where you're going to begin composting it, you may have already lost a fair amount of nitrogen because of the volatilization that occurs right after urination and defecation. So that actually gives you a little bit of an imbalance in the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio, and that could end up resulting in a lot of phosphorus leaching into rivers and lakes. So what we do is we advocate adding the biochar before these nitrogen losses, and that's in the bedding. So this is another paper talking about the use of biochar in a poultry litter. Talked about a 20% volume biochar in bedding. Resulted in actually higher body weights of this particular turkey farm. And they talk about it, how it reduced the litter cake. That's the caking of a manure that coats the top of the bedding, and that sometimes needs to be cleared off because of the fact that it causes dermatitis on the feet of poultry. Also, another cautionary tale is that if you put biochar into the bedding in a poultry barn, the birds will likely want to actually consume some of it. They seem to enjoy that in their gizzards. So it's very important to use a biochar for bedding where that you have actually checked out to make sure the heavy metals content is as low as possible, low in order to preserve keep for the better health of the birds as well. So another reason to be very cautious and aware of what kind of biochar is being used, especially when it is potentially being consumed by animals. This is just about the use of biochar in open areas and barnyards, and just that outdoor pens absorb. It also absorbs odor and moisture from those places. All the benefits we've already mentioned. You don't need to use the smaller granular biochar pieces when you're going out into open areas and in pens, because the animals will actually walk around and crush it down. Helps to control high mud problems, so control the muck in outdoor settings as well. So, if you're using biochar in animal bedding, you're going to be helping to absorb moisture and adsorb nutrients right from the get-go. Faster composting and microbiological activity once you get that bedding out to be composted. And then it can possibly expand the bullseye of how far you can take that manure from your farm, because it increases the value of that manure and increases that nutrient load in the manure compost. There's also been a number of quite a bit of research, even at the University of Lethbridge in Alberta here, on the use of biochar as an animal feed ingredient. We're still in the early days of that. One of the final sort of conclusions, and even in the abstract of this paper, if you look up these papers, is that applying biochar and manure together might benefit. There's a bit of a, these are early days, so there's the word might in there. Benefit soil carbon sequestration by lowering the CO2 emissions over that evolve out of the soils that have been amended with carbon with biochar. Biochar can also be used in anaerobic digestion on farm, or where if you use a biochar ingredient in the animal in the anaerobic digester, you can get an increase in the actual methane yields from that digester. This is a case or a paper that was published that demonstrated a 10 grams of biochar per liter of wastewater sludge going into the anaerobic digester. You can also use biochar as a blend to the solids coming out of the anaerobic digester as well, and then use that in a co-composting fashion. This was a paper that I read and was kind of an aha moment for me. You can actually look this paper up. It's available publicly, and it just shows what is the process that happens to the biochar as it's being composted. And this is a diagram showing, a pristine piece of biochar compared to a piece of biochar that was actually pulled out of a compost mix that had been composted with biochar pieces. And the important thing here is how there's a time release benefit when biochar absorbs nutrients from the composting process. So here we can see that the green bar was nutrients that were extracted over a 1 hour period of time. So they were using potassium chloride as the extraction medium. And how much additional nutrients were able to be extracted by going for longer and longer periods of time. So this is these are all the green, red, and bars were over 1 hour, and then the blue portion of this bar chart is a 20-hour extraction, and then it went to 48 hours and then 96 hours. So it takes longer and contact with the calcium chloride in order to extract those nutrients, which gives you a sense of how there is a kind of a slow release organic nutrient value of this nutrient-loaded biochar from the co-composting process. So this is also another indication. You can see there's a pristine particle of biochar and the amount of carbon that's there versus nutrients versus a co-composted particle and the additional nutrients that are on that co-composted piece. This also demonstrates the benefit of having particles. So we sell our biochar for soil amendment as a 2 to 6 millimeter sized particle size distribution rather than the very small piece powdery char. Powdery char doesn't have as much ability to get coated with the organic coatings, but it certainly is still there, but just not necessarily as strong, as beneficial. And then this on the right hand side is just simply, so these 4 bars show nutrients, nitrogen, aluminum, silica, magnesium, calcium, and iron. So these are sort of plant available nutrients. And then this side of the chart shows carbon to carbon bonds, so single and double bonds, hydrogen bonds to carbon, oxygen. These are the the carbohydrates and such that are attaching to the char pieces. So those are the organic nutrients that are available to the soil food web, so the microbiology. So you can see again, the particles have more nutrients attached to them than the powder does, but also very much more than pristine powder, pristine biochar going into the soil. Which we do not recommend it. And most of this work was done in this paper was done using X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy. And so, they actually did these measurements by actually looking at the surfaces of each pieces of char that were extracted from a compost process. And you can look at that look that paper up with Dr. Google. New opportunities for green manure. So that's plants that have been harvested, possibly from a cover crop, for example, and then placed in a pile or a static pile. And what we're advocating is the use of biochar in these static piles to do a co-composting process so that you can conserve the nutrients in that product. And then this is a work that Don Harfield and Don Harfield is the VP of Technology and Operations for AirTerra, and I spoke into the process where there was a review of the code of practice for composting facilities in Alberta. And we were able to revise that section 2 of that acceptable feedstocks portion of that document to include biochar. And it's the definition is that it's biochar made from means charcoal produced from wood, so it's a wood feedstock, and it's not been chemically treated, so it's this organic wood, and it is made with a product to ensure that you have a completely organic, pristine charcoal product as what you're using to amend into bedding or compost. And then the acceptable amendments, it actually indicates that biochar is an acceptable amendment, but this is the definition of it. So you can look this up as well. I've given a kind of the link for that. There's an economic benefit to biochar, but not at the kind of scales that we've been generating it up till now. We believe, and so AirTerra's understanding from our economic analysis is that we'll need to build a plant that produces 5,000 or more tons per year of biochar, and the cost will be down below $500 per ton. But current small-scale production renders biochars to be a little bit more expensive than that at the moment. But we have a couple other factors that will bring the price of biochar down as well. So then the circular economy aspect of it is that we're advocating the use of biochar in bedding for livestock, and then the use of that based on farms that are not more than 50 to 100 kilometers away from our production facility, just to reduce the transportation costs. And the benefit of having it in the bedding is that it's absorptive for ammonium and nitrous oxide and nitrates. So then it could be used as a co-composting ingredient as well to create a nutrient-dense, microbially enhanced and inoculated biochar for soil amendment. The feedstock, it can also come from farms. We're looking at the possibility of short rotation coppice harvested trees, so from shelter belts or eco buffers or alley crop trees on farm. It's not necessary. I mean, we definitely can use residual wood from the forest industry as a feedstock, but we believe that to generate a very economic biochar, we might be looking to the actual farmers who use the biochar as also the feedstock providers to sell a wood fiber feedstock for us. The other two benefits that need to be internalized in order to bring the price of biochar down is to internalize the value of the carbon credits that are recognized internationally for placing charcoal into soils this way. 1 ton of biochar would command about 3 tons of carbon credits. And right now, carbon is selling for about $50 a ton in Canada, which would bring $150 per ton of biochar as a benefit to that price. There's also an equivalent, approximately equivalent value to selling the renewable natural gas that comes off of the process, the synthetic gases that come off while making the biochar, and to use that as a replacement for fossil natural gas. So the more we deploy biochar for agriculture, the more the prices fall, the more competitive new markets for biochar get generated, and then the demand increases some more so we can deploy more. So this is just the virtuous cycle of scaling up, and we are hoping that this will be something that happens in Alberta. So to summarize, biochar significantly benefits as an agricultural soil amendment. The co-composted biochar is much more effective and beneficial as a soil amendment than pristine. And in fact, pristine biochar distributed on soils can actually be detrimental for the soil in the early days because the biochar is going to be absorbing nutrients and potentially withholding them from plants for a while until they get loaded up. And so we're not advocates of that. We're advocates of co-composting biochar before amending it into soil. So if you use biochar in animal bedding, it's going to have the benefit of being microbially inoculated and nutrient charged right from the start. It can be used in a series of stacked functions as a deodorant in the barns, indoor, as a sponge for the volatilizing nutrients to prevent them from escaping, and an enhancement for animal health and animal bedding, and a co-composting enhancer. If not used in animal bedding, it still can be used as a co-compost benefit. That's what we've got for you. We're definitely open to any questions or contacts at a later point. Thank you for your patience to listen.
Well, that was awesome, Rob. I think we got a few questions in. So like I said before, if you have any questions, just put them in the Q&A. We'll get to them here today. Trevor, I see you answered a few. Let's see here. Go over some of these questions here. So the first one was, this was the one that Trevor answered. So specify soil test depths, specify soil test depth is 0 to 6 inches and 6 to 12 inches, but what if depths are 0 to 6 inches and 6 to 24 inches? Will the depth or deeper depth sampling meet requirements, or must farm change sampling depths? So he answered the 0 to 6 and 6 to 12 inch depth is for the soil texture is a one-time measurement. So yes, one-time measure of soil texture 0 to 6 and 6 to 12 will be needed. The 0 to 6 and 6 to 24 sample would not give an appropriate texture measurement. The samples for 0 to 6 are soil nitrate and 0 to 60, which cannot be older than 3 years, can be accomplished with the 0 to 6 and 6 to 24. So here, we have a question for you, Rob. So if producers have access to sawdust, then blending it into animal bedding should give similar advantages to biochar. The sawdust would have the smaller surface for soil microbes to absorb to and have the ability to soak up nutrients from the manure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's something that's a practice that has been in place. Use of sawdust as a animal bedding ingredient, and then composting sawdust and using it as a soil amendment. Sawdust will also kind of bind up the nitrogen as well. I mean, in terms of how long it holds on to that nitrogen. So that's a good thing, but it can be a bad thing as well in terms of allowing that nitrogen to be plant available. That's the whole difference between sawdust and biochar. Biochar has charged surfaces that allow those nutrients to be taken up by the plants more easily. And also the biochar doesn't decompose the way sawdust does in the soil as well. So it's there for hundreds of years. So it's once you've amended the biochar into the soil, it's going to stay there and continue to work as a surface for nutrients to absorb onto and be available for plants.
Mm-hmm. A question for you, Trevor. I see it was in the chat here. What are your requirements for runoff controls? All facilities that require an approval require runoff controls for cattle pens. What about registered facilities? What is required?
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for the question. Under AOPA, for the permitted facilities that we have for AOPA permitting, there needs to be run-on and run-off controls. And traditionally, the applicant can put forward options, but traditionally it's berming or prevention of run-on through these livestock pens and corrals. And then we have a requirement for capture. Traditionally we use catch basins to capture any runoff from those facilities for later treatment and or application. Our treatment is generally spreading it onto fields when it's okay for absorption, but you can make a catchment basin that doesn't use application, but if we make them big enough and shallow enough, we can use evaporation as our treatment method with later scraping out of the solids as they accumulate in our catch basins. So that's for all our permitted facilities, corrals, etc.
Okay. And while I have you here, Trev, too, I see there was a question earlier in the chat there. There no slope limit if an application is not near a body of water.
Very good point. You're right. If it isn't near a common body of water, there isn't a slope limit. But within our legislation, you cannot let the manure contaminated water leave your property. So while there may not be a common body of water that the drainage is going into, but if manure, because of the steepness of the land, did leave your property, that would be contravening the act in the sense that it needs to stay on your property. But you're absolutely right. If it's a steep slope and there's no manure at the bottom of it and there's nowhere for it to go and leave the property, there isn't a limitation for application like you do adjacent to a common body of water.
Question for you, Rob, here in the Q&A. Why is pristine biochar called biochar and not just charcoal? Isn't the bio part of biochar the life that coats and inhabits the charcoal? I'm suggesting that charcoal becomes biochar after the decomposing process of inoculation.
Can you rephrase that? I mean, why? Can you start? What was the start of that?
Yeah, so why is pristine biochar called biochar and not just charcoal?
Well, it actually has it's a common name for biochar is also charcoal. I mean, but biochar by very nature, the definition is that it's a charcoal that's destined to be used as a soil amendment. So it's ready. It's a product that's being out there made available to be used as a soil amendment or a co-composting ingredient. Rather than being used as an energy product like charcoal or for generating electricity or whatever it might be. So it's really a definition more than it is, it's a matter of definition. The pristine biochar is being sold intentionally for use in soils. That's the only differentiation.
Okay. Oh, okay, I'll allow this one. So John, we have the producer here, John. He has a hand raised. I'll allow him to speak there. John, you want to ask your question?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the other things about the difference between charcoal and biochar is the amount of volatile materials that is left in there. If you want to make a barbecue, you need to heat up the charcoal, drive the volatiles into a form of gas that will then burn and help to get your fire going. You want to avoid all of that if you want to make biochar for use in soil or in other applications like Rob has been describing. So that really is, to my mind, the fundamental difference is the very high fixed carbon content and the very low volatiles.
Absolutely. No, that's the whole objective of the biochar production process, is to eliminate those volatiles and to have just simply fixed carbon as much as possible. Yeah.
Well, that's awesome.
Good
Thanks,
point.
John.
Yeah.
We have another question here from Tony. What are the chemical and physical differences between biochar and coal directly from a mine?
So coal directly from a mine is going to be devoid of a lot of porosity because it's been under such pressure over time in the geological storage of that material. It's also going to be loaded up with volatiles. Coal has a significant amount of methane and volatile components associated with it, and frankly, petroleum oils and things like that in it. And it's definitely not something that is approved by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency to use in soils.
Yeah. I do have there's a question here for you, Trevor. What is the difference in the requirements for smaller facilities requiring registration and larger facilities requiring an approval?
The difference between the registrations and approvals in our system, within AOPA, there are 3 different types of permits. Registration and approvals have to do with the livestock numbers, expansions, or new development. The third one, approvals, and if somebody from the NRCB here could get into a lot more details on this, but approvals are for a change in an operation without a change in livestock numbers. So if I want to upgrade my facility or storage, I can get an approval for it where I'm not changing my livestock numbers. Now, the difference between a registration and approval is simply comes down to number of animals. Registration size has fewer animals in it than an approval size. I'd have to look them up, but so X number of animals would get you a registration. When you're above that, it goes to an approval. Now, within the system, there are very slight differences in the process of getting those registrations and approvals through the approval process with the NRCB on how it's done, but essentially the difference between the two of them is number of animals, or number of animals.
Awesome, thanks, Trevor. We answered that one. Okay. From Rusty Sten, if the biochar is capturing additional nutrients, how does this impact the release of the nutrients that we see today in field production?
How does it impact the release of the nutrients that are used in field production? Is that what's said? In terms of the chemical nutrients, the chemical fertilizers?
So here, I'll ask the question again just to make sure. So if the biochar is capturing additional nutrients, how does this impact the release of the nutrients that we see today in field production? So I would assume, fertilizers.
Well, it would add to the nutrients that you're amending into the soils, and we're showing from the research that those nutrients do not leach through the soil profile as quickly as soluble chemical fertilizers and industrial available soluble fertilizers. Maybe there are also organic fertilizers that are being applied, which are slow release and so have similar features. The whole difference, I guess, between the biochar nutrients is that they make themselves more available for plants to uptake because of the cation exchange capacity benefits of the char pieces that the nutrients are attached to. And it's a matter of managing nutrient application to know what the requirements are for the soil to not over apply. I guess if you're applying biochar and chemical fertilizers, you just wouldn't want to be applying more chemical fertilizer than is necessary based on how much is available in the soil from year to year. Yeah.
Okay. Another question for you, Rob. So from Kim, apologize, as might have missed at the beginning. Where are the wood chips sourced from to produce biochar? Is it a waste product?
It's defined as a waste product, has to be sourced from sustainably managed forest industry residuals. So these are end pieces, sawdust, slash from the forest operations, things that are being left behind and that would actually be otherwise be burned. So that's the intent of the feedstock for biochar, unless you're actually purpose growing trees for a biochar feedstock. In that case, what we're advocating is coppice, short rotation coppice harvested tree wood fiber for the use as a feedstock.
That kind of answers this next question too. We have what kind of wood do we use to make biochar? Well, it's not damage the forest. And then I see you basically answered.
The intent is not to be doing unsustainable forest harvesting for biochar feedstock. Yeah.
What about the use of coal dust? Would that byproduct from coal production be used similar to biochar? Thinking of availability by spar wood.
Okay, so there is a coal, there's a type of coal that's used as a soil amendment. That's humalite, for example. If anybody's heard of humalite, humalite is the liardonite coal, and that is actually sold as an agricultural soil amendment. And it's sold for the fact that it contains a lot of what's beneficial for soils called humic acid. So coals, depending on how much humalite is in them, can actually become an organically certified soil amendment. One of its problems is that it will actually dissolve into water and leach away and have to be replaced from year to year, whereas biochar is not soluble in water and remains as a resilient fixed carbon that remains in the soil for actually hundreds to thousands of years. So the other aspect is that using coal as an agricultural amendment doesn't have the carbon sequestration value in terms of being able to work as a carbon dioxide removal technology or a negative emissions technology for mitigation of climate change and CO2, atmospheric CO2 issues that we have today.
Let's see here. Trevor, what would a cabinet operation that's under 300 M and 31 M from a water course be required to do? Just be registered, soil test, and record where manure goes?
Well, generally speaking, if this is a cow-calf operation where the animals are generally on pasture through the summer, they wouldn't be required to have a permit. Now, it's going to depend on how they're being managed. If they're being managed in a way that feed is always being brought to these animals and they are not out in pasture during grazing, during what would be considered a typical grazing season here in Alberta, they may be considered a confined feeding operation. And then depending on our numbers, and I'd have to look up, under 300, I don't think they would have to, but they would have to have a registration. I don't think that's the case with this example, and we'd have to talk about it specifically or have a conversation directed to the NRCB for determination, because it's up to them. Yeah. As for their location to a water body, they still have requirements for contaminated runoff leaving their property. So they could have requirements of a catch basin or something from the corrals, whatever they're being fed in, if there is a risk of it going off site, and that's something they'd have to evaluate, or if somebody's complained about it, that's what would be looked into. As for the manure application, they're likely producing more than, well, if it's out on grazing, they're not collecting the 500 megatons of manure, but that's if they spread every year. But if they've been collecting the manure for several years, they may be spreading over that 500 metric tons. And then again, that record keeping requirement and soil testing requirement come into play. Regardless, even if they aren't collecting that much manure, they would still have the manure application setbacks required for when they do spread their manure for the size of operation that they are. Although it's always a great idea to be having the record keeping anyways, just for your own peace of mind.
Mm-hmm. I will make this note too. I see Deanne has been making note of in the chat. Please see the AOPA reference guide. For specific example, I'm not sure which one, but she suggests page 5 for the different types of permits and page 6, table 1 for the number of animals that triggers a registration versus an approval. And that can be found at open.alberta.ca/publications.
Great, thank you very much, Deanne. Deanne Madsen works. We work together. She's based out of Morinville, and so I really appreciate her help with getting that up there on in our AOPA reference guide, which provides the details of everything we presented today. And then she's added the extra information on the registration, approvals, size of operations, and the processes involved. So thank you, Deanne.
I have an interesting question here. Using bone, is it something that might add value as an agricultural waste product with biochar?
Yep, there's been some talk about making biochar from bone, and so it's bone biochar. The only caution that I would have for the use of bone biochar is to make sure that it was manufactured in a way that's sensitive to the possibility of the issue of a prion that might be in an animal. So you could be applying prions because biochar can actually provide a pretty nice habitat for the prion to be in. Just as a caution on the feedstock of the bone biochar.
Oh, that's great. Last question here, unless somebody asks another one from Mahesh. Can we use the leftover charcoal from forest fire? Is that possible to access?
Yeah, people are talking about, and people are doing some of that in the U.S., gathering up forest fire charcoals. Of course, you don't have the granular control on that. You're going to be crushing that in order to make it turn it into a benefit, a convenient particle size distribution for the soil. Also, it doesn't have the kind of control on the temperatures. You're going to have variations in the temperatures that that wood was exposed to, or that charcoal was exposed to in its formation. Some of it's going to be 100 degrees and 200, 300, the whole range, and you won't have the optimum temperature control in terms of removing all of those volatiles as we talked about earlier. Yeah.
Last chance for any more questions. Oh, we do have one. This one, I think it's for you, Trevor. In situations where a catchment pond is necessary, who is responsible for sizing it?
Well, it'll be part of the application process. So anybody that goes to developing new or expanding a CFO will be going through the permitting process with the NRCB. Within that process, it's outlined in what the requirements for size are. Generally, the applicant would be proposing a size location to meet the requirements, but NRCB will be checking all that as well to determine if, based on rainfall, evaporation in your area, and the size of your facility and the size of the contributing area, if the catch basin proposed in that development would be big enough. And if not, the permit wouldn't be granted until the facility is redesigned such that it can accommodate the anticipated rainfall runoff from that site.
No. Looks like that's all the questions. I'd like to thank everyone that was able to join us today and for the entirety of the webinar series. Rob and Trevor, thank you so much for presenting to everyone here today. The information you both provided was outstanding. It was really, really appreciated. I would lastly like to thank everyone that spread the word out about the webinar series. A quick 2-minute survey will be sent out later today or tomorrow morning regarding the webinar series. If you could please fill it out, we'd appreciate it. Any feedback on improving the webinar series for next year is greatly appreciated. And on a final note, the webinar series recordings will be posted by tomorrow morning or by Wednesday, give or take. So keep an eye out for the link to the recordings. And thanks everyone, and till next time.
Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah.
Take care.